that we can talk about, which is a good thing. I mean, for about a month now, all the news has been terrifying. Like about a month ago today, this moment, I was in the nether. I was on a plane coming back. No, actually, I was just getting on a plane right now, coming back from the Netherlands, where I had performed all around the country doing some stand-up comedy. And little did I know, within a day or two, there would be this international travel lockdown. And then a few days after that, we would all be locked in our houses. So I feel like I'm like the last person or one of the last people to ever make an international trip. If you look at the worst case scenario, I mean, there are people, it's striking to me on something that's so important for our lives. It's striking to me how someone says, "Hey, Harry Potter." I'm more like James Potter, who was Harry Potter's father. But yes, thank you. It's striking to me how very quickly we let everybody shame us into staying locked in our rooms, not going outside for even a walk. You're not allowed to say, heaven forbid, if you say to somebody, this might be like the flu. If you say that, that is the most politically incorrect thing you could ever say. People will shame you to death if you say coronavirus is like the flu. And it just bothers me that the same kind of partisan lines and polarization that happened in the U.S. on the political side seems to be happening about a virus. Like, shouldn't we all be... This is this one opportunity where we really get to step up as a species and have the entire species become unified towards a single goal for the first time in our history. And instead, we let it just polarize ourselves. Like if I talk to a Republican, they say, oh, we should be trying hydroxychloroquine. If I talk to a Democrat, they say, never try hydroxychloroquine. And I forget, when did hydroxychloroquine become a political issue so neatly divided? And whether you love Trump or you hate Trump, it doesn't even matter. You should rise above it and say, look, we're all fighting for a common goal. And let's take a look at hydroxychloroquine for a second. We don't know if it works or not. The FDA has approved it for use on coronavirus. Why did they approve it? Did they approve a bad medicine with horrible side effects? No. Hydroxychloroquine has been around since the 1940s, curing malaria, lupus, other diseases, and under medical supervision, it won't have the side effects as if you take it yourself. So, of course, take it with a doctor. And now, there's some evidence in China that hydroxychloroquine might work. There's evidence in France. Something like 40% of private physicians are recommending hydroxychloroquine to their clients. So I'm not saying Trump is right or Trump is wrong. I'm not saying use it. I'm just wondering why an issue like that, you have to always ask yourself when you have an opinion, is this opinion being my own opinion, or am I being dictated this opinion by some other group that I'm somehow psychologically a member of? We want to avoid groupthink. Always be a skeptic. And as I mentioned a week or so ago, if you have an opinion, I don't really count an opinion as valid for myself unless I can go on the other side of that opinion and argue it even better than the people on the other side. So let's say I want Joe Biden to be president. I should really check myself and I should argue as hard as possible that maybe Trump should be president. Or if I'm for Trump, I should argue as hard as possible, maybe Joe Biden should be president. Maybe Andrew Cuomo should be president. You don't really know if your opinion is good or is good for you unless you can argue the other side even better than people on the other side can. You should always be able to argue both sides before you can make a calculated decision. And I can make an argument on either side. You can make an argument on either side for almost everything. I can even make an argument, like of course anybody sane believes that the earth is round. We've known that for hundreds of years from just basic science, and we know that because we have sent rockets to rotate around the planet. But just for exercise, try arguing the flat earth side. It's actually not that hard, because if you look out the window, the world looks flat. It's really hard to convince somebody who just lives in their own village for thousands of years that the earth is round. Oh, you could say, well, it's obvious the earth's round. I don't know. It wasn't obvious for 200,000 years, and then all of a sudden it became obvious. So always, I'm not saying the earth is flat, but again, don't have, so many people have such strong opinions, like hydroxychloroquine, that's a bad drug. For 70 years, it's been curing malaria, one of the most vicious diseases on the planet. For 70 years, it's been curing lupus. For 70 years, it's been approved by the FDA. So let's give it a chance. Many studies have shown that there might be an effect, or it might not have no effect. We don't know. But don't make your decision because Donald Trump says so, or because Anthony Fauci says so, or because Joe Biden says so. Then your opinion is not your own. You're like a robot being programmed by these other people. Form your own opinions. So, someone says it's like Trump haters hope it don't work, hope it doesn't work. You know, you can argue on both sides that people have made mistakes. The Democrats and the Republicans have made mistakes during this. But there's not a blame game because only the Eastern countries have experienced pandemics in the past 30 years. Only the Eastern countries seem to have been prepared. Now, when the U.S. tried to prepare for pandemics, we were preparing for flu pandemics like bird flu, swine flu. These are the ones that have affected the world in recent decades. SARS wasn't such a big deal. So, everybody was unprepared for this virus pretty much. So you can't blame one person or the other. Cuomo didn't buy ventilators when he had the chance a few years ago. Trump didn't stock up on ventilators. Nobody stocked up on finding a vaccine or a cure. Here's what we know. Here is some good news. I'll tell you the one good news, and I haven't even been diving into the good news lately, but I'll tell you why in a second. The one good news is that New York City hospitalizations fell or stabilized every single day this weekend. So hospitalizations happen 12 days after someone's infected. So someone gets infected with coronavirus, then they're symptom-free for about 5 to 6 days, and then they have small symptoms for 5 to 6 days, and then if their symptoms are severe, they go to the hospital. So after 10 to 12 days, they go to the hospital. So that means that starting around 10 days ago, if there's fewer hospitalizations happening every day now, then starting around 10 days ago, there were fewer and fewer people infected. So that's really good news. Someone says, nice jacket, thank you. It's got me on it. It's a choose yourself jacket. So designed it myself, although someone else made it. But again, I think there's very good news out there in terms of New York City, which has been like the epicenter, the capital of coronavirus, more deaths than any other city. New York City has had a decline in hospitalizations day over day for the past several days. Hopefully that's a trend that continues. We'll see. But all the models now, even Cuomo, even Trump, were predicting April 5th, which was yesterday, was the peak for New York City. That doesn't mean it's over. It just means that now we won't see exponential growth anymore. We'll start to see stabilization and then leveling off of cases and hospitalizations and deaths. And that will mean the healthcare system will have less of a burden. And by the way, there's all these kind of tent hospitals that have come up in New York City, and there's the SHIP that's a hospital. They're empty. I went down to the tent hospitals in Central Park, and you can't really go in there, but I sort of did my thing and asked around and poked around and, pretended to be a doctor or whatever so I could find the information. And they were empty. There were 3 people in these tent hospitals. So it's not like hospitals were getting overworked in New York City, but hospitals, there was the fear that they were going to be overworked. And also there was the fear that healthcare workers were going to get sick, which is true, which all the healthcare workers are certainly heroes. And that's the problem with this, that we weren't prepared in New York City. But the good news is, again, hospitalizations down day over day in New York City. And if New York City is 40% of the cases in the U.S. right now, that means the U.S. is going to start to peak, which means the economy. Some people are saying, oh, no, we can't reopen the economy until 2022. Are you insane? The economy is going to reopen by the end of this month, or else we're in trouble. And again, It's not a Democrat versus a Republican issue. It's not a stock market versus people's deaths issue. I've actually known more people in the past 3 weeks who have committed suicide than have died from coronavirus. The economy is society. Who pays for doctors? The economy does. Who pays for the ventilators? The economy does. They're not apart from each other. You have to have both. I think the biggest problem that we've had in the past few weeks is that healthcare officials who are really good at solving healthcare issues have been solving issues for the entire government, and that's not quite appropriate. We need experts involved in every aspect of government. As someone says, we're all on the same team. It's not like I've been spending the past 3 or 4 days donating to specific types of GoFundMes. So anybody who has like a small restaurant or a small business where they laid off people, I encourage them to send me the GoFundMe. Because the GoFundMe is funding their employees who have been laid off. Send me the GoFundMe. Not only will I donate, but I'll share it in a big list that I'll put out. This is really important that we as a community step up and help people who need help. And we all need help a little bit. We all are getting anxious. We all are feeling a little bit of despair because of the uncertainty, the fear. So I'm going to check to see, by the way, periodically if there's any questions. Go ahead, ask any questions. Jay, who works for me. Okay, best book on my bookshelf. It's hard to say the best book on my bookshelf, but I will tell you one book that I've been recommending is Man's Search for Meaning. This is a guy who was in Auschwitz or one of the concentration camps related to Auschwitz, and he survived by trying to find meaning in your life. And so it's important to ask yourself, what will I do on the other side of this? How will I provide value for others? How will I provide meaning in my life? And this is not just so you can be successful. It's not just so you could have money. But when you're of service to others, and I spoke about this in a podcast that's being released tomorrow, but when you're of service to others, it releases this neurochemical in your brain called oxytocin. And oxytocin is the same neurochemical that's released when you have sex. It's the same neurochemical that's released when you eat chocolate. It's a feel-good chemical. So when you have gratitude and when you are of service to others, you release enormous amounts of oxytocin in your brain, which basically makes you happier. And why is this important now? Oxytocin, I didn't know this until I was speaking to my guest on the podcast tomorrow. Oxytocin suppresses another neurochemical called tachonin, which is the neurochemical that's released when you're feeling stress from isolation. And we're all isolated right now. We're all kind of by ourselves. And the more oxytocin you release in yourself, and again, you release oxytocin by being of service to others and having gratitude. So one way you can be of service to others is donate your time. You have time and money and energy to invest. So you can donate your time. You could sign up for crisistextline.com or .org, which allows people who are in crisis to text you. You could sign up. You can volunteer and in New York City, this is easy to do. You can volunteer at a homeless shelter. They're having problems keeping people 6 feet apart online. You can donate $10 to a GoFundMe of helping employees who have been laid off in this crisis. So there are many ways to donate time. There's ways to donate money. Even if you don't have a lot of money, there's ways to donate money. There's volunteer where you can do Zoom or Skype with the elderly who are feeling lonely. And all of this, again, releases the neurochemical oxytocin, which is the love chemical, it's called, and oxytocin suppresses the stress chemical, which is released when you're feeling isolated and lonely. And we're all feeling a little bit isolated now. Even if you're with loved ones, we're not going out as much. So also, very important, get some sunshine, particularly early in the day, because that sets your metabolic rate so you don't get jet lag while you're isolated. Another thing very important, this brain scientist told me, make sure at least a few minutes a day you have panoramic vision. So we're all like kind of closed in on our phones and our screens and our TV. So make sure for 5 minutes a day you get to go outside and look at a horizon or look at a big, vast difference. And I didn't know this. Apparently that triggers the calming system inside your body. And I had no idea that that was true. Maybe that's why people feel calm when they look out at an ocean, or when they look at a sunset, or when they look at a sunrise. But it's otherwise, if you don't do that, we're just looking at our books and our phones all day long. So it's very important. And I'm going to tell you some other advice that this guy gave me. He gave me 6 things. One was looking at a panoramic view. The other is getting sunlight. The other is, this is an interesting thing. You want to occasionally have right now we're feeling stressed all day long, and that's not good. But it's good to feel periodic stress to boost your immune system, so your immune system gets used to it. So maybe play a game, or maybe, I don't know, solve some problems, play Sudoku or whatever. That's a little bit of stress, and it actually boosts your immune system. So somebody asked, am I working on a book in the lockdown? Yeah, I'm working on a book. It's called Skip the Line, and it's about how if you're at any age, let's say you're 18, or let's say you're 45, or let's say you're 65, you could figure out what your passion is, and then you might say to yourself, oh my gosh, I'm 65. How am I ever going to get good in this new passion? Well, I've gotten good at things in midlife, and I talk about how you can skip the line so that you could be in the top 1% of whatever field you want. And I have a bunch of techniques for doing that. And the important thing is, the reason I wanted to write this is, whenever I'm trying something new, like let's say I get interested in something new. Like, I was over 30 years old when I got interested in investing, and I wanted to start a hedge fund. I wanted to be a professional investor. And everybody said, oh, you can't do that. You can't. Whenever someone tells you, the more people who tell you you can't do something, it absolutely means you have to do that thing. You're going in the right direction. Because it's only on the other side of can't that you find success. And I've learned this over and over and over again. So, like one time, I was working at HBO, and I was a computer programmer at HBO. I wasn't like making TV shows or anything. But I wanted to pitch this idea, and I called the idea 3 a.m., and the idea was I was going to go out on a Tuesday night and interview basically prostitutes and drug dealers and whoever else was out at 3 in the morning. And trust me, if you were out at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday night, just think about the last time you were out at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday night. You probably were not up to anything good. You probably weren't just taking a walk with the cat or whatever. You were probably doing something pretty interesting that I would want to interview. So I left my cubicle in the computer department, and I started walking towards the office of the CEO of HBO. His name was Jeff Bewkes. He later became the CEO of Time Warner. And I ran into a friend of mine who was the head of marketing, and she said, where are you going? And I said, oh, I'm going to visit the CEO. And she's like, you can't just up and visit the CEO of HBO. What do you think you're doing? How are you going to visit the CEO? And, the CEO at the time was my boss, was the CEO of HBO. So I skipped over all my bosses. I skipped past this person who kept telling me, you can't do that. I went into the CEO's office, and he looked up and he said to me, who are you? And I introduced myself, and I said, I have this great idea. You always want to do original. HBO is so successful for original programming on TV. Why don't you create original shows for this brand new thing, the World Wide Web? And he said, whatever, do it. You have my permission. And then I did it for 3 years. And they even shot it as a pilot with HBO documentaries. Thank you, Sheila Nevin, who's now the head of alternative programming at MTV. Always going on the other side of can't is where nobody will ever, you will never get punished for going on the other side of can't, unless you're breaking the law, of course. But you will always, it's always an experiment. The key thing in life, and this is the key thing in my next book, Skip the Line, the key thing is to do experiments. And an experiment should have very little downside on money or time, but huge upside. So for instance, you might have an idea for an app, and you're thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, I've got to raise money, I've got to build this app, I got to whatever. No, you can just, I had an idea for an app once. It was a good idea, and I posted it on freelance.com, and I asked the programmer some questions, and it turns out it wasn't technically possible to build this app I wanted to build. So I learned something new about freelance.com. I learned something new about programming. I learned something new about apps. And I had so I did this a little experiment. Will this app be good? And I learned a huge amount of things, even though the experiment failed. I didn't actually do the app, but I still learned. So that's the point of view of any experiment. And when you're starting to learn something, there's something called the 10,000 hour rule that Malcolm Gladwell popularized. Well, guess what? The 10,000 hour rule is total bullshit. I don't believe it. It does not take 10,000 hours to make a living at something you feel passionately about. But I'm going to change that a little bit. I'm going to say I'm going to call it the 1,000 experiment rule. So if you can do 1,000 experiments, then you'll learn from each experiment. And then just by definition, an experiment means nobody else in the world has done it before. Otherwise, you could have read about it. So if you do these experiments, you're going to learn 1,000 things that nobody else in the world knows about this field that you're so passionately interested in. And so that's going to make you one of the best in the world almost automatically. So someone says, does it take 10,000 hours to be an expert? No, I'm saying that is what it's supposed to be, but I'm saying that's bullshit. I'm saying much better in today's environment to get really good at something quickly is not to spend 10,000 hours just doing the same activity over and over again, but to do 1,000 experiments. So for instance, if I want to be a successful blogger, maybe I'll blog about a story in my life. That's an experiment. Maybe I'll blog about 10 ways to be a better public speaker. That's another experiment where I'm being educational. Maybe I'll blog about some historical thing. So that's another experiment. And then I'll put it in my status update on Facebook. That's another experiment. Maybe I'll put it in LinkedIn. That's another experiment. Maybe I'll say it and make it a podcast, and that's another experiment. So if you experiment over and over and over again, you'll learn so much about how to get better at whatever it is you're interested in. It won't take you 10,000 hours. It'll take you however long it takes to do 1,000 experiments, or maybe even 100 experiments. 10,000 hours is not the law. Someone says 10,000 hours is the law. 10,000 hours, here's where the 10,000 hour rule works. If you're trying to be in the top 1% of memorizing a long string of numbers, 10,000 hours of practice will help you. And that's about it. The 10,000 hour rule is only good for like repetitive activities over and over again. But doing experiments is let's say you want to get good at chess. Okay, here's an experiment you could do. Instead of opening the way everybody else opens the game with, the pawn in front of the king, 2 spaces, why don't you take the knight and put that out? Or why don't you take the rook's pawn and move that out? There's all these ways you can experiment in any field you want. So if you're interested in learning something or trying something, think of 10 experiments you can try that require very little money, very little downside, and okay, here's a skip the line strategy. Find the top 5 people in the industry and interview them. That is a great skip the line strategy. So when I was getting good at, and I'm still getting good, it's one of these things where the more you know you need to know. But when I was starting to do stand-up comedy, I wanted to get good really fast. I wanted to skip the line. So fortunately, I had a podcast, and I was able to get some of the best comedians in the world. Sebastian Maniscalco, Gilbert Gottfried, TJ Miller, Paul Reiser, all these great comedians, Tiffany Haddish, came on my podcast, and I was able to drill them about how they became a stand-up comic. So that was one method of skipping the line. Another method of skipping the line for me is whenever I had a choice to do something that was safe versus something that was terrifying, always choose the thing that's terrifying. So for instance, one time I had to perform, I had a choice. Do you want to perform after Bill Burr or before Bill Burr on a lineup one night? And Bill Burr is one of the most famous comedians in the world. He's in the top 10 comedians of the planet. And everybody else said, there's no way I'm going to follow Bill Burr. He's too good. I don't want to be embarrassed. And so everybody chose to be before Bill Burr. I chose to be immediately after Bill Burr. And because that's the only way you're going to learn. That's an experiment. If you don't challenge yourself, you're never going to stretch yourself. You're never going to learn. Another time, I wanted to get good at capturing an audience's attention. So instead of going to a stand-up comedy club, I went to a Subway and I did stand-up comedy on the Subway. Talk about an unfriendly audience. It's just an experiment, and I had no downside, but I was scared to death. I went on that Subway and I thought, there's no way I'm going to do this. And then I just started opening my mouth and doing stand-up comedy. I started saying things like, oh, I thought this was the 6.5 train to take me to Hogwarts. Where am I? I just called an Uber pool, but they sent me this Subway instead. This was like 4 years ago, 5 years ago. And sometimes people laugh, most of the time they hated me. But that's an experiment where I did get better because I did that experiment. So whatever it is you're interested in, there are always techniques to skip the line. You don't need, the 10,000 hours is bullshit. It's a way to keep you in line rather than, and believe me, every stand-up comic told me, you got to wait your turn, man. You got to pay your dues. Trust me, I've paid my dues in life. Now I get to do what I want. And so skipping the line is what I'm always going to want to do. So, again, think in terms of experiments. Think in terms of who you can learn from. Think in terms, and when you think of an experiment, you can't lose when you do an experiment. I'll tell you another experiment I did. I wanted to, after Donald Trump posted, he did a tweet, this was like a year ago, he did a tweet that he wants to buy Greenland. And I didn't even know you can buy a country. Can you buy a country, Greenland? So I did an experiment. I had never done a Kickstarter before or a GoFundMe. So I did a Kickstarter. Hey, I'm buying Greenland. Here's why. And I listed all the reasons why. And I actually started raising money and people started sharing it. And then Kickstarter, or it was GoFundMe, they censored me because they knew I was trying to raise $100 million. They knew I wasn't going to succeed. And so they didn't want to have all the credit card chargebacks and blah, blah, blah. So they and then they made a whole big deal about censoring me. So that was an experiment to buy Greenland. Did the experiment succeed? Of course not. I didn't buy Greenland. But what happened? I had never used Kickstarter before. So now I know how to use Kickstarter. I found a new way to distribute my articles. Everyone else puts their articles on LinkedIn. Now I can put my articles on Kickstarter also. I learned more about Greenland. I didn't know anything about Greenland. I learned more than I will ever need to know in my lifetime about Greenland. And then I was able to write a whole story about what happened. So I was able to write the story that I put on Kickstarter, and then I was able to write a story about trying to buy Greenland. So my experiment failed, or did it? I learned a huge amount from it. And that's the beauty of experimenting. There's no such thing as failure, and every time you do a properly constructed experiment, you will win. You will learn more and you will get better at whatever it is you're trying to get better at. So for instance, right now, I'm building a game and it's similar to Cards Against Humanity. Hit like if you've played Cards Against Humanity with your kids. So I'm doing another version that's specific to what I'm interested in. And then now I'm going to use, because I know how to do it, I'm going to use Kickstarter to see what that initial customer base looks like. And again, experiments are only useful. And again, if I had to do 10,000 hours to get good at Kickstarter or writing, or if I had to be like, I don't know, a world leader in order to say I'm going to buy Greenland, I would never buy it. Or I would never put out anything to buy it. Instead, doing these experiments allows you to skip the line, and I have all sorts of techniques, and that's what I'm writing about in my book. The book was due last week. I'm still finishing it. Don't tell my publisher or my agent. And it's coming out next February. I'm not even trying to advertise it. You can't buy it right now. You'll buy it next February. But I love this idea of looking at things in terms of experiments rather than that 10,000 hour rule, which has hindered so many people from success. With the 10,000 hour rule, you can only really succeed if you're a child prodigy. Otherwise, you'll always think that you can't do something. But exactly when you think you can't do something, that's exactly when you should try to do something. So now, just want to mention one more thing about coronavirus. I'm switching tangents a little bit. Another interesting thing about coronavirus, which was, it's not in the news, but there was a lot of research, including my brother-in-law did research on this, which is that the more you're exposed to someone with coronavirus, the more likely you are to get it, and the more likely you are to get a severe case of it. So in terms of making policy, if someone's 6 feet or 10 feet away, you're probably not going to get coronavirus from them. even if they have it. So now if you're with someone all day, or if you're at a conference with someone, or if you're on a cruise with someone, or if you're working side by side with someone, you might get it. But we have to be very careful the next time something like this happens, that we don't just shut the entire economy down, because you're probably not going to get it from people who have it if they're not just coughing on you, or if they're not touching the same things you're touching all day long. So again, we have to understand what the science is and what the data is the next time we make policy that affects a billion people. Billions of people are affected by shutting down the economy. People are killing themselves. There's domestic violence. There's addiction problems. There's depression. There's anxiety. There's all sorts of issues that happen when you do these kind of isolation. The reason we're going to have a hard time getting back to a new normal is because we've shut down the economy for only 3 weeks, and already something like 15 million people are unemployed. So it's really a shame this has happened, and I don't know who to blame. There's no blame, but they should not have shut down this economy. I feel like maybe people were sort of bullied into doing it, either Democrats or Republicans. They were sort of bullied into doing it. And again, we have to remember, everyone needs to, healthcare officials are good at solving healthcare problems. But leaders, it's very important, if you're a leader of anything, that you need to look at the whole circle. And it's not balancing deaths with the stock market. The economy is healthcare. The economy is mental health. The economy pays for doctors. The economy pays for ventilators. The economy keeps people happy. It keeps jobs going. It keeps you in your home. Now, if this extends another month, what's going to happen? You can't just write checks to everybody every month. We have to go. So someone says there won't be any going back to normal. I kind of agree with that. There's going to be a new normal, and we don't really know what's going to look like. But here's what we do know. First off, the reason the stock market's up today is because it's pretty clear this virus has an end. If you were on this IG live 3 weeks ago, you would have heard me say every pandemic has a beginning, middle, and end. And if you look, and I compared the US with all the countries in Asia, and I said it looks like it'll be about 3 or 4 months. And I said this was 3 or 4 weeks ago, I said April 15th will probably be the peak, and June 1st will probably be kind of the end, give or take a week. But the economy needs to get into place by early April. Now, the stimulus package was passed, and I do think the stimulus package, don't even call it a stimulus package, call it a Band-Aid package. I do think it has stopped the bleeding for a few weeks. If we get the economy back by end of April, early May, we'll be okay. But that's the latest, or else we're going into Mad Max territory. So I do think they're aware of that. I do think the economy will come back in, sometime in April, hopefully the latest, early May. And then there will be a new normal. And the new normal is I want you to write down the word remote and underline it. There's going to be remote work. There's going to be remote learning. There's going to be remote delivery for food. You're not going to go to restaurants as much. You'll get delivery. There's going to be, remote medicine, remote therapy. Any business model that involves remote is going to win. So so the last thing you want to think about is, I'm going to start a new pizza restaurant in New York City. That's a bad idea. But if you start an idea that sort of makes drones deliver pizza, that might be a better idea. Or if you start a way to make online learning easier, like let's make an accreditation program for online learning. Or content. We're all creating content on YouTube or TikTok or blogs. Let's make a tipping jar for content creators who don't have big enough audiences to get advertising. So any business model that involves remote is very important. And, Jim McElvey, who started the company Square, I don't know who uses Square here, but Square is it's the thing where you slide your credit card through an iPhone. So Jim McElvey is worth about $1.5 billion. He started Square, and he told me one idea: when you're thinking about a business model, think about the bottom third of society. So that's always a huge empty market. So for instance, Square allows mom and pop stores or e-commerce sites to accept credit cards when they never were allowed to accept credit cards before. They didn't have enough clout to accept credit cards before. So Square solved that problem, and now every everybody in the bottom 1/3 of merchants can now accept credit cards because he solved this one simple problem that the bottom third of society needed, or the bottom third of a market needed. So if you solve problems for the bottom third of a society, then you're going to have a huge multi-billion-dollar model. So let me see. Do I believe we'll have 80,000 people in sports stadiums anytime soon? No. But, it's not like the day this ends, you're going to suddenly go to the World Series or whatever. Like, people are still going to have a hard time. People are going to go outside. They're going to get sunshine. They're going to take walks. But I don't think they're going to be going to huge events that time soon. But let's think of the business model immediately. What business model would you think of immediately to allow 80,000 people to go to a sports stadium? How about we make the event a virtual reality event where you can go with all your friends. You could all meet in the virtual reality. You can watch the sporting event in HD film, so it's as high quality as possible. And maybe you could even walk on the field because you're in virtual reality. So, I'm not saying that's a good idea or a bad idea. It's just, I just saw the question. But anything with VR and combining VR with events and conferences, that's going to be probably a huge win. How to skip the line. Somebody asking, how do you skip the line to be a programmer? I will tell you exactly how to do it. First off, take one simple course. Take like a beginning programming course on Code Academy. So Code Academy is an online learning site, and they teach basic Python, basic SQL, basic Java, basic JavaScript. Take a basic JavaScript course. Now, here's the way I skipped the line. So I didn't switch majors to computer science until I was a senior in college. And everyone said to me, guidance counselor said to me, you can't do that. You can't switch majors when you're a senior. You have never even taken a computer science class before. So I skipped the line. And the way I always did it was I took software that somebody had written and I set it up on my computer and I changed it. And I would make small changes. I would have a guide with me, like I'd have a book. And I would make small changes, and then I would make sure every change I made worked. And then suddenly, if you make enough changes, if you do enough experiments on a working program, then suddenly you're good enough to be a programmer. I learned how to program so incredibly quickly by modifying other people's programs and not starting from scratch. And then eventually, I was able to start from scratch. But again, it was this probably more like 100 experiments, and by the time I was finished with the 100th experiment, I skipped the line, and I was starting to get paid to be a programmer. So, how to fight with the fear of not being perfect. That's a great point. There's that saying, envy is the thief of joy. And, when you compare, you despair. And I think the key is, so somebody asking about how to skip the line to be a writer. I'll answer that in a second. So how do you give up not being perfect? I think the key is to realize is that life is not about successes and failures. Life is just about experiments. Imagine when you were born, you were sent here from, here's what I always imagine in my head. It's BS, but it's what I imagine. I imagine that I was sent here from some other planet, kind of like Mork from Mork and Mindy. I was sent here from some other planet to learn, and then I'm going to learn about successes, I'm going to learn about failures, and then when I die, I'm going to bring it back, all my learning back to my home planet, back to the mothership. And so now, it reconfigures what perfection means. Perfection is not whether you are the best golfer in the world, or the most handsome in the world, or the best writer, or the best programmer, or have the most money. Perfection is if you're curious enough, and if you're willing to take chances when you're terrified, and if you're willing to experiment to learn. And by definition, again, doing an experiment means you're not perfect. So even the best football players and baseball players in the world, even the best athletes, even the best scientists, they're always experimenting because the more your curiosity is, that means you see more possibilities than everyone else. Your possibility muscle is on fire. And just by having possibilities in front of you, by definition, you're not perfect because you don't know what will happen when you try those possibilities. But by experimenting, you will learn which possibilities are right for you, which are wrong for you, and that will change your compass so that you go towards the thing that you love the most. It doesn't mean you shouldn't have goals, because let's say I have a goal for 5 years from now. that goal's meaningless. I might learn something tomorrow that will change the goal. So you can't really, I might have a goal today, but don't have a goal for 5 years from now, because the experiments you do tomorrow will change that goal. So again, this is all related to perfection. Focus on perfection of curiosity. How curious can you be? Don't make statements, ask questions instead. Like I always ask myself, like, what content can I create? What new businesses can I start? What new ways can I make money? What new ways can I be of service to others? There are so many more questions to ask each day. What can I do on these Instagram lives that will be interesting and entertaining? There are so many good questions to ask. You don't want to waste your time thinking thoughts of like, oh, am I perfect or not? Or why is this person better than me? There are so many people better than me at every area that I love. I mean, it's frustrating. I've spent my entire life playing chess. Am I the best in the world at chess? No, I'm pretty good, but a good friend of mine happens to be the former world chess champion. And so when I see him, do I think to myself, man, I'm a piece of shit because I'm not as good at chess as this guy? No, he was the world champion. There's always going to be someone better than you, but I can be curious. I can learn more things. I can learn more things about life. I can figure out by experimenting, I can figure out the unique things I'm good at. And don't forget, a very important part of experimenting is idea sex, where you take two things and combine them into one new thing. So for instance, here's a great example of skipping the line in comedy. I know a guy who's 27 years old. His name's Chris Turner. Great guy. He's been on my podcast. So Chris Turner, he performs at any comedy club he wants. He could probably even do a comedy special at this point. He's so good. How did he skip the line in comedy? Usually people go do comedy for 15, 20 years before they have a Netflix special. How did this guy, Chris Turner, at the age of 27, become one of the best comics out there? I'll tell you how. He goes to the audience, he asks the audience to give him 5 random words, and then on the fly, he makes up a rap, like kind of a gangster rap, about those 5 words. And it's so interesting the way he does it, and he's so good at it, that it's catapulted him to the top. He combined comedy and rapping, and he became the #1 comedy rapper in the world. If you combine, another great example is, there's so many great examples. Star Wars obviously is the combination of westerns and science fiction with a little bit of the story of Jesus in there. Music, Wyclef from the Fugees. The Fugees had that song "Staying Alive." Imagine combining "Staying Alive" from the movie Saturday Night Fever in the 70s with hip hop. Combine those two, the Fugees had this huge hit called "Staying Alive." So again, when you do idea sex, it's amazing the results. You can think of anything. I want to combine Asian food with Mexican food. Okay, we're gonna put sesame. We're gonna make sesame chicken and put it in a taco shell and put like beans on it. I don't know. I'm just making it up. But imagine Mexican Chinese fusion, and you have a whole new restaurant. So again. Idea sex is the fastest way to take 2 well-known areas, combine them, and then that's another way to skip the line. Suddenly you're best in the world at the combined area. So for instance, I became a professional investor. I ran a hedge fund for a long time, but I also had writing skills. I was a writer. I had been writing since 1991, and I combined the 2 skills, and I started to become I don't want to say one of the best, but I started to become well known for my financial writing. So the Financial Times had me write a column, the Wall Street Journal, I started writing books, and that's how I started writing books, is that I was really good at combining the skills of finance with writing. And by the way, I've made a lot of money by combining those skills. At writing, I was kind of a failure, and at finance, I was okay. But combining finance with writing, I became one of the best in the world. So you always want to combine 2 or more ideas to be successful at something. So for instance, when the web came along, that's why this is in 1995 when I pitched the CEO of HBO on this idea of doing a web show. I combined HBO's ability at making TV shows with my own ability at creating websites, and I created one of the first web shows. I could argue that was the first interview podcast out there. I was interviewing every day. I was interviewing prostitutes at 3 a.m. in New York City, and I learned a huge amount. Who's my favorite character on Breaking Bad? I have to say it. I think Gus is my favorite character on Breaking Bad. I don't have to go into that if you haven't seen Breaking Bad, but I think Gus is a pretty cool character. How to make learning stick. So this is a really good question. Let me just see it here. So here's a really good question. How to make learning stick. The important thing for making learning stick, this is what I do. If I read a book, let's say I read this book, which I have. Whenever I learn something in the book, whenever I think something's interesting, I write it down on my waiter's pad. So waiters, you always want to, what percentage of a nonfiction book do you think you remember when you're done with it? I used to think it was about 10 to 20%, but then I asked a bunch of really smart people how much they thought they remembered from a nonfiction book, and the common answer I got, and when I thought about it, I agreed, was about 1%. When you read a nonfiction book, you probably only remember 1% of it, which A, is why it's good to reread books, but B, it's really important to take notes while you're reading, and that, for me, that's how I learn the most. Now, I also have the benefit, I can usually call the author and get him or her on my podcast and ask them whatever questions I want, and so that's another way I learn. And then the other thing that's important is, whenever I have a good podcast where I learn a lot, I actually start implementing those ideas into my life. So for instance, the other day, when I had this brain scientist on, and I'm asking, how do we avoid anxiety when we're all isolated? And he said, being of service to others triggers oxytocin, which suppresses the stress chemical tachonin, which is the chemical created from isolation. Or at least looking at the horizon once a day will trigger the calming system in your brain. Or having a lot of light in the morning helps prevent the jet lag feeling you'll get when you're isolated. So he had all of these ideas that seemed common sense, but he had them based in science. And so I started doing them in my daily life. He gave 6 suggestions, and I started doing them. So that's another way to learn, is when you actually start doing something. I'll give you another example that's made me an enormous amount of money. So Yuval Harari wrote this book, Sapiens. Now, the main thing I remember from Sapiens is that, and his next book, Homo Deus, is that everything in society tends to move from theism, a belief in God, to humanism, a belief in humans, to dataism, a belief in data. So if you look at medicine, we used to, if we got injured, we would pray to our gods, and we'd go to the priest or shaman, please cure us, please say a prayer for me. And then that moved into humanism, where we'd go to a doctor, take 2 aspirin, call me in the morning, and now we go to data. Oh, here's my blood sample, do my blood work, what's my genome look like? Oh, here's the medicine that AI tells me I should take. So we've gone from theism to humanism to dataism in medicine. The same thing happens with money. So in money, if you look at the dollar bill, here's a $2 bill. So in a $2 bill, we've got somewhere in here, we're going to have in God we trust, so theism. So money has always depended on theism. And then we have humanism. Oh, if you believe in Thomas Jefferson and that America's strong, humanism's good. Then we're moving towards dataism. So Bitcoin is an example of a data-driven currency. Whether or not you believe Bitcoin is a great investment or not, suffice to say, Bitcoin's been around for 11 years, and it's got $200 billion invested in it. So Bitcoin has pretty much survived the game right now. So again, moving from theism to humanism to dataism. So ask yourself, what other areas of life are going to move from theism to humanism to dataism? What about, so I'll give you an example. By the way, $2 bills are great. I hope they never get rid of them. And here's Saddam Hussein, issued in 2001. I think it's 25 Iraqi dinars. And then I've also got, here's what we have to avoid in life. Here's what we have to avoid as a society. Very important. And I'll show you right now. We just did a $2 trillion stimulus package. So in Zimbabwe, they also did a big stimulus package a couple of decades ago. And that's a $100 billion bill. So their inflation got out of control. you don't wanna have us printing $100 billion bills. But someone asked earlier how to skip the line as a writer, and the main thing to do to skip the line as a writer is have something interesting to say. So again, if you're just going to say, everybody needs to stay at home and wash their hands because of coronavirus, that's not interesting. That's not new. If you write it, you're not saying anything new. You're not skipping the line. Now, if you write this amazing story about your mom and how it got you closer with her because of coronavirus, maybe that would be an interesting story. But if you say, here's the top 10 conspiracy theories about coronavirus, that might be a unique article, although even that is like a little bit tired. So always try to, but let's do idea sex with this. 10 business ideas because of coronavirus. Okay, well, how about pillows that are shaped by the molecule, or shaped to look like the molecule? Or how about t-shirts? Like, I got coronavirus and all I got was this lousy t-shirt. Or how about a card game where we're all trying to avoid getting coronavirus? Or how about like a pandemic version of Chutes and Ladders? Like you just hit the Spanish flu. You got to slide all the way down. Oh, you just hit a vaccine. Now you get to climb the ladder. So again, idea sex and coronavirus and writing. Again, always, if you want to skip the line with writing, take two ideas and write about the combination, and that's how you'll be successful. So a love story that takes place in outer space is idea sex. If you could have that's been done, but if you have a unique slant on that, or there's all these teenage novels about friends who are depressed. Well, what if your friend who was depressed happened to have been a time traveler who is stuck in high school and he's from 14,000 years in the future? So again, if you want to skip the line as a writer, very important to read good writing. And I like to read good writing every day before I start writing. I don't have any of the books around me at the moment. But if you want to skip the line as a writer, read good writing and combine ideas. So it's not good enough to say, don't write an article like, this is why it's important to be grateful. I've read that article. But maybe write an article about how it's not just about being grateful, it's about solving difficult gratitude problems. So there are many times, I'm always grateful I have kids. That's easy. But what about how can you be grateful when you're, isolated? Even that feels tired to me. I feel like a lot of people have written that. How can I be, what's an opportunity to be grateful when someone close to you dies? That would be an interesting, difficult gratitude problem to write about. So again, you always want to take combinations of things. And another important thing, here's a very important skip the line trick with writing. Very important skip the line trick with writing. Don't publish something unless you are afraid of what people are going to think about you. I will rewrite an entire article, or I will trash an entire article if I'm about to hit publish and I realize, you know what? I'm not afraid of what people are going to think if I say this. I'll go back and rewrite. I'm not trying to be contrarian, but I'm trying to think of what do I think really deeply that is unique to me, that I'm afraid of what my mother's going to think or what my friends are going to think. Or for instance, I'm pro-choice. I'm very pro-choice, but one of my best friends is pro-life, and we don't argue about it. He's entitled to his opinion. I'm entitled to my opinion. But if I were to write down discussions we have about pro-choice versus pro-life, I would be afraid of what pro-choice people or pro-life people would think about me. That would be something that would be scary to me to write about and expose publicly, even though I'm extremely pro-choice. See, even now, I'm afraid of what you'll think of me if I say I even have conversations with someone who's pro-life. So these are the important things. The best way to skip the line as a writer is to say something you're afraid to publish. So in 2005, in the Financial Times, I wrote a column about why I think kids should stop going to college. And I was afraid what people would think about me. And I did at the time. Now it's a normal conversation. People will still disagree with me, but at least it's a valid conversation. In 2005, I got hate mail. I got death threats. I lost one friend, a very good friend of mine. She said, how could you say that? College, you learn so much, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, yeah, but why should my kids spend $300,000 to get an education. And meanwhile, kids who are in the bottom third of society or who come from impoverished neighborhoods, they won't get the same leg up, or they'll have to go into huge debt, or they won't go to as good a school. It kind of increases the income inequality gap. And do you really need 4 years to get a degree, an expensive degree? And now all these students, a generation of students is in $1.6 trillion in debt. But she unfriended me immediately on Facebook and blocked me on Twitter. I lost friends. So I try to never write something unless I'm worried what people will think about me. Unfortunately, that means I get a lot of hate mail, but fortunately, I'm just saying what I believe. Say what you believe, but say something unique that you're afraid of what people will think about you. What will happen to brick and mortar casinos is another question someone just asked. Brick and mortar casinos, out of business. Then how are they going to exist? First off, the people who go to casinos are the most susceptible. I've been in a lot of casinos, okay? I used to be for a year, I was a professional poker player. I used to go to a lot of casinos. And who are in casinos? A bunch of people who smoke and a bunch of people who eat enormous amounts of food at the buffet line. These are the people most susceptible to getting sick from the next pandemic and then spreading it. So casinos are going to decline and go out of business. But what does this mean? For every negative, there's a positive. The positives are there's probably going to be huge business models for online casinos. And there already is a business model for that. But I think there's going to be actually more opportunities for prediction markets. So I don't know if you've ever tried a prediction market. It's fantastic. Go to predictit.org as an example. You can bet. You can actually put money in, and I've done this, and I'll bet, is Trump going to win or not? Is Joe Biden going to win the nomination? Is Cuomo going to run for president? How many tweets will Donald Trump do between now and the end of the year? Will Mike Pence be the VP candidate? There's hundreds of things you could bet on relating to politics. And it's so much fun because it's not based on your opinion. Your opinion means shit. It means, like, you could think Andrew Yang should be president, but you're not going to put money on betting that he's going to be president. So it forces you to really compare your opinions with reality when you have skin in the game, as Nassim Taleb would say it. And that's why I love these prediction markets. I don't have many bets on right now, but I had a bunch of bets on recently, but I recently took them all off. Right now, I am betting that I had a bet that I'm losing. I was going to bet that Sherrod Brown, the senator from Ohio, was going to be the VP nominee. I do have a bet on that Stephen Breyer is going to be the next Supreme Court justice to leave the Supreme Court. He's not as old as Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but the prediction market's giving me 12-1 odds. He's 81 years old, so why not put a bet? If I got 12-1 odds, it seems like a reasonable bet. Ruth Bader Ginsburg's getting almost 1-1 odds, so that's not a good bet. Will Trump win the popular vote in 2020? I'm getting 3-1 odds that he's not going to win the popular vote, so I bet on him. Why not? If he even gets an uptick after this coronavirus thing is over, then I'll take my bet off. I don't have to wait till the election. So I love these prediction markets. I think they're going to replace online casinos to some extent. They're going to be much more popular. And I think prediction markets have a useful societal function. What if people around the world were able to bet on what the next country was going to be hit by the coronavirus? Now, the people in that country would probably have an insider information advantage, and they would bet, and that country would soar on the prediction market, and so it would be a good indicator for public policy decisions. So prediction markets could be useful. These kind of online casinos involving real-world situations could be. By the way, you're only allowed to bet $1,000. You only can put $1,000 into Predictit.org. You can't bet all your money. But the CEO of the company. So I called the CEO of the company and I asked him, "Do people make money on this?" And he told me, and I was surprised. He told me people have quit their Wall Street jobs just to focus on prediction markets all day long. So I guess you can make money. I'll tell you how much money I did. I started with $1,000, and now I'm at looks like about $1,440. So I'm up 40% in the past 6